In the early hours of May 1945, along a narrow road outside Pilsen, the engine of a 3-ton truck ticks as it cools. Its paint is blistered, the canvas cover torn by shrapnel. Ammunition crates sit half unloaded in the ditch. There is no driver. The steering wheel is still warm, but the road ahead is silent. Across Europe, from the Baltic coast to the Alps, thousands of similar vehicles stand frozen in place, engines dead, fuel tanks empty, paperwork scattered in the mud. They were not destroyed in battle. They were simply left behind. By the spring of 1945, the German war effort was collapsing under the weight of its own logistics. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies were driving through Silesia and Brandenburg. Rail networks were shattered by bombing, bridges lay in rivers, and fuel depots had been reduced to ash. The German army, which had once relied on speed and movement, now found itself unable to move at all. Trucks, the backbone of its operational mobility, became liabilities rather than assets. Orders still demanded movement, but there was no diesel to obey them. As units dissolved or surrendered, vehicles were abandoned wherever they stood. At its height in 1941, Germany possessed roughly 600,000 military trucks in active service. These ranged from standardized models like the Opel Blitz to hundreds of thousands of requisitioned civilian vehicles from across occupied Europe. Unlike the United States or Britain, Germany never fully standardized its truck fleet. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was operating more than 2,000 different truck types, each with different spare parts, tires, engines, and maintenance requirements. What had once allowed rapid expansion became a logistical nightmare under sustained Allied pressure. Fuel shortages defined the final phase of the war. Synthetic fuel plants were systematically targeted beginning in mid-1944, reducing output by more than 90% within months. By January 1945, many German units were receiving less than a quarter of their authorized fuel allotment. Trucks were often issued fuel vouchers instead of fuel itself. Drivers were instructed to abandon vehicles once tanks ran dry and proceed on foot. Entire columns were left along roadsides, stripped of radios and weapons, then forgotten. The scale of abandonment was unprecedented. In France alone, Allied recovery teams documented more than 70,000 German vehicles left behind after the retreat from Normandy and the collapse in August. 1,944. In Italy, thousands of trucks were abandoned during the withdrawal north of Rome and later along the Gothic Line. On the Eastern Front, losses were even more severe. Soviet forces reported capturing or finding destroyed and abandoned tens of thousands of vehicles during the Vichy-Loder offensive and the final advance on Berlin. These trucks were not simply transport vehicles. They carried artillery ammunition, bridging equipment, fuel barrels, medical supplies, and field kitchens. Without them, German divisions became static formations, unable to reposition or resupply. The abandonment of trucks accelerated collapse. Once vehicles were lost, units could not regroup, heavy weapons had to be destroyed, and organized withdrawal became impossible. The planning behind Germany's truck fleet had always been compromised by industrial limits. Germany entered the war without the capacity to mass-produce trucks on the scale achieved by the United States. Civilian production was fragmented, and military demands competed with aircraft, tanks, and submarines for steel, rubber, and labor. As a result, the Wehrmacht relied heavily on captured vehicles from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. By 1942, more than 25% of German trucks were foreign-built. Maintenance of this fleet required a vast spare part system that Germany never fully achieved. Tires were a critical weakness. Natural rubber imports were cut off early in the war, and synthetic alternatives were inferior and scarce. By late 1944, tire wear alone was grounding thousands of vehicles. Trucks sat immobilized, not because engines failed, but because they had no usable tires. When the end came, there was no coordinated plan for disposal. German high command issued conflicting orders. Some units were told to destroy vehicles to prevent capture. Others were instructed to preserve equipment for post-war use or surrender intact. In practice, destruction required explosives or fuel that units no longer had. Many vehicles were simply pushed off roads, drained of oil, or left exactly where they stopped. As Allied armies advanced, they encountered vast vehicle graveyards. British and American engineers reported roads blocked for miles by abandoned German transport. In some areas, vehicles were stacked bumper to bumper, evidence of panicked retreats halted by air attack or fuel exhaustion. The vehicles varied widely in condition. Some were mechanically sound and fully loaded. Others were burned-out shells, destroyed by their crews in the final hours. Allied investigation teams moved quickly to catalog what they found. The U.S. Army Technical Intelligence Units and the British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers inspected thousands of captured trucks. Their reports noted the diversity of models, poor standardization, and chronic maintenance issues. While German engineering quality was often praised at the component level, the overall system was judged inefficient and unsustainable under modern mechanized warfare. In the Soviet zone, captured trucks were treated primarily as reparations. Vehicles that could be repaired were pressed into immediate service. Others were stripped for parts or melted down. The Red Army faced its own post-war transport shortages and made pragmatic use of whatever could be salvaged. In Eastern Europe, German trucks became a common sight in post-war reconstruction, often repainted and repurposed by new regimes. In Western Europe, the fate of abandoned trucks followed a different path, and they were gathered into centralized depots by Allied authorities. In France and Belgium, fields were turned into temporary vehicle parks holding thousands of German trucks. Local governments, desperate for transport to rebuild shattered economies, petitioned for access. Some vehicles were distributed to civilian agencies, farmers, and construction firms after inspection and modification. Scrapping, however, became the dominant outcome. By late 1945, Europe was awash in surplus vehicles of all types. The cost of repairing and maintaining a heterogeneous fleet of worn-out German trucks often exceeded their value. Spare parts were scarce, documentation incomplete, and skilled mechanics in short supply. Large numbers were dismantled for steel, copper wiring, and usable components. Environmental and logistical considerations also played a role. Abandoned vehicles, blocked roads, contaminated farmland with oil and fuel, and posed safety hazards. Clearing them was a priority for occupation authorities. In some regions, scrapping operations employed thousands of workers, turning former instruments of war into raw material for rebuilding cities and industries. Not all trucks disappeared immediately. Into the late 1940s, German vehicles could still be seen hauling goods in rural areas, particularly in Eastern Europe and parts of Scandinavia. Their longevity varied. Some Opel Blitz trucks remained in civilian service for a decade or more. Others failed quickly due to lack of parts and heavy wartime wear. Historians examining the German truck collapse emphasize its strategic implications. Germany's inability to sustain a standardized, fuel-secure transport fleet undermined every aspect of its military strategy. Blitzkrieg depended on mobility, but mobility depended on logistics. When fuel production collapsed and transport diversity overwhelmed maintenance systems, the Army lost its ability to maneuver. Post-war military planners took note. Allied studies concluded that truck standardization, fuel security, and industrial depth were as decisive as tanks or aircraft. The United States emerged from the war with a doctrine that placed logistics at the center of operational planning. The Soviet Union, having witnessed both German failure and American abundance through Lend-Lease, pursued its own path towards simplified, rugged vehicle designs. The abandoned German trucks of 1945 were not symbols of technological inferiority. Many were well-designed and competently built. They were symbols of overextension, of an economy pushed beyond sustainable limits, and of a war effort that outran its industrial base. Their silent presence across Europe marked the point where movement ended and collapse became irreversible. Today, only a small number survive in museums and private collections. Restored and polished, they offer little sense of the chaos in which most were lost. The majority were cut apart, melted down, or simply rusted into the ground where they were left. Return again to that road near Pilsen. The truck is gone now. The ditch has been filled, the road resurfaced. There is no marker to show where it stood. But for a brief moment in 1945, it represented the end of a system that had carried an army across a continent and then failed quietly, without ceremony. The war moved on without it, leaving steel and silence behind.